My stepmother didn't forget me at the Vancouver airport. She left me there on purpose. And she didn't even look back. I was 17 years old, standing in the middle of the International Departures Terminal at YVR with nothing. No phone, no passport, no boarding pass, and about $11 in my jacket pocket. I watched the departure board flip to boarding for our flight to London, and I thought, she's going to come back for me. Any second now. She's going to realize what she's done and come back. She didn't. I need to back up a little. Because if I start in the middle of that airport, you're going to have a lot of questions. And honestly, you deserve to understand how a 17-year-old ends up abandoned by the one adult who was supposed to protect her. It didn't happen in one moment. It never does. My dad remarried when I was 9 years old. My mom had passed 2 years before that, ovarian cancer, fast and brutal. And my dad was the kind of man who didn't know how to be alone. I understood that later. At 9, I just knew that one day it was just the two of us eating frozen waffles for dinner, and 6 months later there was a woman sitting at our kitchen table who kept calling me sweetie in a way that felt like a warning. Her name was Nadine. She had a son from her first marriage. He was 15 when they moved in, and from the very first weekend he was in our house, I understood that I was not going to be a part of whatever family they were building. My stepbrother Connor had that easy kind of charm that adults love and other kids don't trust. He could walk into a room and make every grown-up in it feel like they'd just said something incredibly smart. My dad loved him almost immediately. Nadine had always loved him, obviously, but the way she looked at Connor and then looked at me. Even at 9, I could feel the difference. I used to think I was imagining it. Kids do that. They tell themselves that the thing they're feeling isn't real because the adults around them keep acting like everything is fine. But I wasn't imagining it. I know that now. Growing up in that house, I became what I can only describe as furniture. Present, functional, and completely invisible. Connor got a car for his 16th birthday. I got a card. Connor got tutoring for his SAT, a trip to Europe with his friends after graduation. I got a part-time job at a coffee shop on Granville Street when I was 15 so I could buy my own clothes. My dad knew, and he didn't say anything. That's the part that still sits in my chest sometimes, even now. He knew, and he chose not to see it. By the time I was 17, I had learned to be small. I didn't ask for things. I didn't make noise. I got good grades because school was the one place where I had any control over my own life, and I knew that a scholarship was my only real exit plan. I kept my head down, I did what I was told, and I counted the months. That summer, Nadine announced she was taking us on a family trip to London and then Scotland. Her parents were originally from Edinburgh and she'd been promising Connor for years that she'd take him. I found out I was included almost as an afterthought. My dad mentioned it at dinner. Nadine smiled tightly, and Connor said nothing. I told myself it was a good sign. Maybe things were changing. Maybe a trip like this would help us all reset. I should have known better. The problem started before we even left Vancouver. I'd been saving my coffee shop money for months, and I'd bought myself a new backpack specifically for the trip. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. The week before we left, Nadine asked to see everyone's travel documents to make copies. Reasonable. I gave her my passport, my boarding pass printout, and the small envelope of British pounds I'd exchanged at a currency exchange on Robson Street. About $300 worth. She put them in her bag. She said she'd keep everything together so nothing got lost. Connor still had his own documents. He carried his own wallet, his own boarding pass. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. The morning of the flight, I woke up early and packed carefully. Nadine was already downstairs with Connor, and my dad had driven us to the airport before his early shift. He wasn't coming on the trip, just dropping us off. He hugged me in the departures lane and said, "Have fun, kiddo." And I remember thinking that I wanted to ask him to come inside with us, just for a few extra minutes. I didn't. I just said goodbye. Inside, Connor and Nadine checked in while I stood slightly behind them. The agent printed our boarding passes. I watched Nadine put mine in her purse without handing it to me. I asked if I could hold on to it. She said she'd keep everything together. Her tone made it clear the conversation was over. We got through security. We had about 2 hours before boarding, and Connor wanted to go look at something in one of the shops down the terminal. Nadine went with him. She told me to wait by the gate. I waited. After about 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't eaten anything and went to find a vending machine down the short corridor near our gate. I wasn't gone for more than 5 minutes. When I came back, the gate seating area was filling up with other passengers. I looked around for Nadine and Connor. They weren't there. I assumed they were still in the shops. I sat down. The departure board showed we were still 40 minutes from boarding. I wasn't worried yet. Then I heard the gate agent's voice on the intercom, clear and calm. "This is the final boarding call for Air Canada Flight 856 to London Heathrow. All remaining passengers, please proceed to gate C47 immediately." I stood up so fast. I knocked over my coffee. I ran to the gate agent was already closing the jet bridge door. I said, "Wait, my family is on that flight. My stepmother has my passport. Please." The agent looked at me. Then she looked at her Sudine. She typed something. She said, "Can I have your name?" I gave it to her. She looked at the screen for a long time, long enough that I knew something was wrong. "I'm sorry," she said. "Your boarding pass was not scanned because my stepmother had it. She was supposed to. Can you check if she boarded? Her name is Nadine." "I can't share information about other passengers," she said, "but I can tell you that this flight has departed." I stood there and I genuinely could not process what she had just said to me. I said, "It's still at the gate. I can see the plane. The doors are closed. I'm so sorry." She was kind. She could see that I was shaking. She called over a colleague and told them to stay with me, and then she got on her radio. And I stood there in that corridor with my carry-on bag and my coffee shop jacket and absolutely nothing else, and I understood slowly and completely that I had been left behind on purpose. Because here's the thing, and this is what took me the longest to accept. Nadine had my passport. She had my boarding pass. She had my money. She had known for weeks that I couldn't board without those things, and she had made sure I didn't have them. When I went to get that snack, she didn't look for me. She didn't ask the gate agent to page me. She didn't delay. She just left. The Air Canada staff were incredibly professional. A supervisor named, I still remember his name tag. It said Paul, came and brought me to a small office near the gate. He gave me a cup of water and a granola bar, which I ate even though I felt like I was going to be sick. He asked me what happened, and I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, very carefully, "And the adult who had your documents, she's aware that you weren't on the flight?" I said, "She knew. She knew I wasn't at the gate." He wrote something down. The next few hours were some of the longest of my life. Airport security got involved. Then the Canadian Border Services Agency. At some point, a woman from CBSA came and sat across from me in a small room that had a table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out onto a maintenance corridor, and she asked me to explain the situation from the beginning. I told her everything again. She had a yellow notepad and she wrote while I talked, and every now and then she asked a very specific question. "When did Nadine take your passport? Did she say anything about keeping the documents? What time did your father drop you off? What is your father's contact information?" I gave her my dad's cell number. Then I sat alone while she went to make calls. I have to tell you what it felt like to sit in that room. Because I think sometimes when people hear a story like this, they imagine the person crying the whole time dramatically in the way people cry in movies. That's not what it was like. I wasn't crying. I was completely still, the way you go still when you're truly in shock. And my brain kept doing this thing where it tried to find an alternate explanation. Maybe Nadine had panicked. Maybe she thought I was already on the plane. Maybe there'd been some miscommunication. But I kept coming back to the same thing. She had my passport. She had specifically taken it from me the week before, told me she was keeping everything safe, and then she had walked onto that plane and sat down in her seat, and she had not asked a single person to look for me. My dad picked up when the CBSA officer called him. I know this because she came back into the room and told me she'd spoken with him and that he was on his way to the airport. The drive from North Vancouver was about 40 minutes in morning traffic. It felt like days. When my dad came through the door of that room, his face was a color I had never seen on him before. Not quite white, something grayer than that. He looked at me, and then he looked at the CBSA officer, and she said I was physically fine. She said there were some things they needed to discuss. What followed was a long, formal conversation that I was partially present for and partially not. The shock was really settling in now, and I kept drifting. What I understood was this. What Nadine had done constituted child abandonment under Canadian law. A minor left without documents, without means of communication, without supervision in an airport by the adult responsible for her. The CBSA officer had also noted that Nadine had in her possession documents belonging to me, which she had not returned and had apparently used to board the flight with full knowledge that I was not there. The officer used the phrase deliberate withholding of identification documents. My dad was very quiet through all of this. On the drive home, he didn't say much. I sat in the passenger seat of his truck and watched the highway scroll past, and I said, "You knew she didn't treat me the same as Connor." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I know." That was all. 2 words. I know. And I have spent a long time figuring out what to do with those 2 words. Nadine and Connor landed at Heathrow that afternoon. By then, my dad had called his brother, my uncle, who is a paralegal in Burnaby, and my uncle had started making calls. The CBSA had flagged the situation with the RCMP. A file was opened. When Nadine's phone connected to the UK network and she turned it on at Heathrow, she had 17 missed calls from my dad. She called him back. I wasn't in the room, but my dad told me later what she said. She said she'd assumed I had boarded on my own. She said she hadn't realized I wasn't on the plane until they were already in the air. She said she'd been trying to figure out how to handle it. 7 hours. She'd had 7 hours in the air to figure out how to handle the fact that she'd left a 17-year-old at an airport with no phone, no ID, no money, and no way to reach anyone. She hadn't called ahead. She hadn't contacted Air Canada. She hadn't asked anyone at Heathrow to help coordinate. She'd been figuring out how to handle it. My dad told her to come home. She didn't. Not right away. She and Connor stayed in London for 4 days before my dad's calls became urgent enough. Or maybe the RCMP contact became real enough that she booked a return flight. In those 4 days, I stayed in my old bedroom in my dad's house, and I went through every piece of information I could find about what had actually happened. Because there was something Nadine had said on that call. She'd said that she'd left me behind because of something she'd heard about me, something Connor had told her. She didn't say what exactly, not in that first call. But my dad told me she'd mentioned it, and the way he said it, I could tell he didn't entirely believe her, but he wasn't ready to say so out loud. I found out what the lie was 3 days later from my uncle, who had been going through things with the RCMP file. Connor had told Nadine, and apparently had been telling her for months, that I had been stealing from her. Specifically, he'd told her that I had been going through her jewelry box and taking pieces to sell. He'd shown her a photo on his phone of what he said was her grandmother's ring, which he claimed I'd taken. He'd told her he'd confronted me about it and I'd become aggressive. He'd framed the entire thing as a safety concern, that bringing me on the trip was a risk, that I couldn't be trusted. The ring, as my uncle discovered when he asked my dad to look for it, was in Nadine's own jewelry box. It had never been taken. Connor had photographed it there, in the box, and told his mother it was gone. When I heard this, I sat down on the floor of the kitchen. Not on a chair, on the floor. I just needed to be low to the ground for a minute. He had constructed an entire false story about me. He had shown his mother fabricated evidence, and she had believed him so completely, so immediately, that she had decided the appropriate response was to leave me stranded in another country. The RCMP concluded their initial review about 2 weeks after the incident. The findings were passed to the Crown. What followed was not a fast process. Nothing legal ever is. But what I can tell you is this. Nadine was charged with abandonment of a child under Section 218 of the Criminal Code of Canada. The charge carries a maximum of 2 years imprisonment. She was also separately investigated for the withholding of my identification documents, which intersected with a mischief charge related to Connor's fabricated evidence. Connor was 19 at the time of the incident, legally an adult. His involvement, the fabricated photos, the months of false accusations he'd fed to his mother, was investigated as contributing to the situation. He was charged with public mischief. My dad retained a family lawyer within the first week. I don't know all the details of what happened in his marriage after that, and I'm not going to pretend I do. What I know is that by the time the legal process was moving, my dad and Nadine were separated. She moved out that fall. Connor went with her. I remember the day the house was just the two of us again. My dad made pasta for dinner, the only thing he really knew how to cook, and we sat at the kitchen table and ate, and neither of us talked about any of it. We just ate. And after a while, my dad said, "I'm going to do better." I looked at him. He was staring at his plate. "Okay," I said. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a door staying open. The legal proceedings took a long time. Nadine ultimately pled guilty to a lesser charge, criminal negligence, and received a conditional sentence. 18 months served in the community, mandatory parenting and counseling programs, and a period of probation. No jail time, which a lot of people in my life thought was too lenient, and honestly, on some days I agreed with them. On other days, I was too tired to care about the sentence and just grateful that the Crown had taken it seriously at all, that there was a record, that it wasn't just something that happened to me and disappeared. Connor's public mischief charge resulted in a fine and a conditional discharge. He was young enough, the lawyer explained, that the court was inclined toward rehabilitation. I had to sit with that. I still have to sit with that some days. I was 18 by the time most of it was resolved. I had deferred my university acceptance. I'd gotten into UBC for English, and in September of that year, I started first year. I took the bus from North Van every morning. I studied in the library until 8 or 9 at night. I made friends slowly, the way I'd always done everything, carefully and with a lot of watching first. I didn't tell many people what had happened to me. It felt like something I needed to carry quietly for a while until I understood it well enough to put it down. I'm 29 now. I work as a content editor at a small publishing company in Vancouver, and I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Mount Pleasant with a cat named Butter and too many houseplants. My dad and I have a relationship that is better than it was and not yet what I wish it could be, but we're both working on it, which is more than I could have said 5 years ago. He remarried again 2 years ago. A woman named, well, I call her by her first name, and she is kind and uncomplicated and makes my dad genuinely happy, and I have never once felt like furniture in her presence. I don't know where Nadine is. I haven't looked. I know Connor moved to Calgary. I know this because a mutual acquaintance mentioned it once, and I made a mental note and then made the deliberate choice not to follow up. He exists somewhere in the world, and whatever he's doing, it's not my responsibility to track it. What I want to tell you, and this is the part I've had the longest to think about, is that the worst thing about that day at the airport wasn't being left. It was how prepared I was to explain it away. I stood in that terminal telling myself there must be a mistake, there must be a misunderstanding. She wouldn't actually do this. I had spent 8 years in that house teaching myself that the way I was treated was probably fine, probably normal, probably something I was misreading, because what kind of adult would actually do that to a child? The answer is, some adults will. Some adults will look at a child in their care and make a choice that has nothing to do with that child's safety or well-being and everything to do with their own convenience, their own fear, their own willingness to believe a lie told by someone they love more. And if you are someone who grew up in a house where you were the one who didn't quite fit, where you were the one who learned to be small, I want you to know that it is not something you did. It was never something you did. The way they treated you was never a reflection of your value. It was a reflection of their failure. I got on a flight to London 6 months after everything, by myself, with my own passport in my own hands and a hostel booked in Bloomsbury and about $400 in my travel card. I stood at that same terminal at YVR, gate C47, and I boarded that plane, and when it lifted off the runway and the city fell away below me, I cried for the first time since any of it had happened. Not from sadness, from something I didn't have a word for then and still don't. Exactly. something that felt like finally being allowed to take up space again. I looked out the window at the mountains going gold in the late afternoon light, and I thought, I'm the one who stays. I was always the one who stayed.